The Great Lakes are vast, beautiful, and can be incredibly cruel. In the late fall of 1966, a huge freighter named the Daniel J. Morrill sailed these waters, a regular workhorse carrying iron ore across the mighty stretches of fresh water. It was a long ship, over 600 feet, built back in 1906, which made it an old-timer even then. For decades, it had plied the routes between the iron ore docks and the steel mills, a familiar sight to anyone living along the shores. People knew it, even if they didn't know its name. Just another one of those big boats that moved the raw materials that built America. But the Morrill, like many ships of its age, had its issues. It was known to flex and groan more than newer vessels, especially in rough weather. There were whispers, quiet concerns among those who worked on the lakes about how much more punishment these old girls could take. This particular trip, though, felt different for some, a silent unease hanging in the cold November air. One of the men on board, a young guy named Dennis Hale, was just starting out. He was a fireman and oiler, one of the guys who kept the engines running, a dirty, hot job down in the belly of the ship. Dennis wasn't even 21 yet, just a kid really, full of the kind of hope and ambition that comes with youth. He'd signed on to the Morrill, hoping to make some good money, a stepping stone to something bigger, maybe a better future. The lake life was tough, but it paid, and he was eager to prove himself. He'd heard the stories about the gales that swept across the lakes in November, the legendary storms that could swallow ships whole, but he figured the Morrill was a big, strong vessel, and he was with experienced men. Still, there was a tiny knot in his stomach, a feeling he couldn't quite shake that this trip might be different. It was nothing he could put his finger on, just a vague sense of dread that he tried to ignore. The ship pulled away from the dock, leaving the relative calm of the port behind. It was late November, a time when the Great Lakes start to show their true, untamed nature. The sky was a dull gray matching the water, and a cold wind was already picking up. The routine on board was familiar to the crew. Everyone settled into their shifts, the rhythm of the engines becoming a constant hum. Meals were eaten in the galley, jokes were shared, and the usual banter filled the cramped living quarters. For the first day or so, the journey was uneventful. The Morrill cut through the choppy water, making steady progress. Dennis spent his time below deck, checking gauges, oiling moving parts, and feeding the boilers. The heat down there was a welcome contrast to the biting cold topside, and for a while he forgot his earlier unease. The crew, a mix of seasoned sailors and younger hands like Dennis, went about their business confident in their ship and their skills. They had faced bad weather before, and they expected to face it again. They just didn't know how bad this time would be. The initial leg of the journey was almost peaceful, a deceptive calm before the storm that would forever change their lives and the history of Great Lakes shipping. The air grew colder, the waves grew larger, but for a short time it was just another trip on the big lake. The deceptively calm waters didn't last. As the hours passed, the mild November weather began to turn nasty. The sky, which had been a flat gray, now darkened further, taking on a bruised, angry look. The wind, initially just a cold breeze, started to howl, whipping across the lake surface and kicking up whitecaps that grew steadily larger. The Morrill, a vessel used to the moods of the Great Lakes, began to pitch and roll with more intensity than before. Below deck, Dennis could feel the change. The familiar hum of the engines was now punctuated by the groaning of the ship's metal hull and the crash of waves against the bow. Up on deck, the seasoned crew members were already moving with a practiced urgency. They battened down hatches, secured loose equipment, and checked their lines. There was no panic, just a grim recognition of what was coming. They had seen these storms before. They knew the drill. But this one felt different, heavier, more relentless. The barometer was dropping fast, and the radio crackled with increasingly urgent weather reports, speaking of gale-force winds and dangerously high waves. The temperatures plummeted, turning the spray that washed over the deck into a thin, icy glaze. Survival suits were laid out, just in case, a silent acknowledgement of the growing danger. The Morrill, despite its size, was starting to struggle. It was an old ship, built in a different era, and while it had been maintained, its age was showing. Decades of battling the harsh conditions of the Great Lakes had taken their toll. The ship was known for its oil canning, a term used to describe the way its hull plates would flex and pop under stress, making a sound like someone stomping on an empty oil drum. In calmer waters, it was just a quirk, a sign of its age. But now, with waves pounding against it like giant fists, the oil canning became more pronounced, a symphony of creaks, groans, and unsettling metallic snaps. The ship was flexing, twisting, and working against itself. Its design was also a problem. It was a straight-decked freighter, meaning it had a long, flat deck with no breaks or raised sections to shed water effectively. When a large wave washed over the bow, it would simply run the length of the ship, adding immense weight and stress to the entire structure. Newer ships had more modern designs, with higher forecastles and deeper sheer lines that helped them ride out storms better. The Morel was a relic, a workhorse pushed beyond its limits. Each wave that crashed over its bow felt like a hammer blow, testing the integrity of its aging steel. Then, sometime in the early hours of November 29th, the unthinkable happened. The storm was at its peak, a furious maelstrom of wind and water. Dennis was likely in his bunk, trying to sleep through the violent rocking, when a sound unlike any other ripped through the ship. It wasn't the usual groan or creak. It was a deafening, tearing shriek of metal, a sound of catastrophic failure. It was followed by a sickening lurch, a feeling of the ship literally breaking beneath him. The Morel, unable to withstand the immense forces exerted by the monstrous waves, had completely fractured. It split in two, right down the middle, like a twig snapped underfoot. The two halves, still connected for a terrifying moment by some twisted metal and piping, began to drift apart. Dennis was thrown from his bunk, slammed against a bulkhead. He knew instantly that this was it. The ship was going down. The lights flickered, died, and then came back on for a split second, long enough for him to see water rushing in. The air filled with the roar of the storm, the screams of men, and the terrifying sound of the ship's structure collapsing in on itself. The speed of it was unbelievable. One moment they were battling a storm, the next, their world was tearing itself apart. He felt the floor give way beneath him, the cold black water rising fast around his feet. The Morel was sinking, and it was taking everyone with it. The Morel's two halves, now completely separated, plunged into the icy depths of Lake Huron. It happened so fast, a violent, chaotic descent into the black water. Dennis was caught in the maelstrom, tossed around like a rag doll. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and shocking his system. He thrashed, trying to get his bearings in the churning water, surrounded by debris and the desperate cries of his shipmates. The screams were everywhere, then quickly faded, swallowed by the waves and the immense crushing cold. He didn't know how he surfaced, but suddenly his head broke the water. He gasped, sucking in the freezing air, his lungs burning. His body was already going numb, the extreme temperature making his muscles lock up. He knew he couldn't last long in that water. His eyes scanned the darkness, trying to make sense of the chaos. He saw bits of wreckage, floating cargo, and what looked like life jackets, but no sign of any large, stable object. Then, through the spray and the gloom, he saw it, a life raft, or what was left of one, bobbing precariously in the waves. It was partially submerged, torn, and looked like it had been through a war, but it was there, a chance. He started swimming towards it, every stroke a monumental effort against the cold and the powerful current. His arms and legs felt heavy, unresponsive. He focused on the raft, on that single, broken piece of hope. When he finally reached it, he grabbed onto a rope, his fingers clumsy and stiff. Pulling himself into the raft was an agonizing struggle. The waves kept trying to rip him away, and the raft itself was unstable, listing heavily. He used every ounce of his remaining strength, hauling himself over the side, finally collapsing inside the flimsy vessel. He lay there, shivering uncontrollably, soaked to the bone but alive. He was in the raft. As he lay there, gasping, trying to regain some warmth, the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a chilling realization. He was alone, adrift in the middle of a raging storm, on a broken raft, and his ship was gone. The full horror of his situation washed over him. He was a small, insignificant speck in a vast, cold and unforgiving lake. Then, through the darkness, he saw movement, shapes in the water, other men. He squinted, trying to make them out. One by one, figures appeared, clinging to wreckage, struggling towards the raft. He saw Frank Mays, the third mate, and two other crew members, George Hamill and John O'Brien. They were in even worse shape than he was, their faces pale, their bodies trembling violently. He managed to help pull them into the raft, a shared, desperate effort for survival. The raft was barely big enough for them, and with each new body, it sank lower into the water. They were huddled together, 4 men against the elements. But the grim reality was already setting in. Hamill and O'Brien were already fading. They were barely conscious, their eyes glazed over. The cold was doing its work quickly. Dennis looked at them, then at Frank, who was trying to bail water with his hands. The lake was a graveyard, and they were floating in the middle of it. The wreckage of their ship, the bodies of their friends all around them. He saw a body float by face down, unrecognizable in the dim light. Another one, then another. The current carried them past the raft, silent and still. It was a horrific sight, a constant reminder of how close they all were to joining them. He tried to speak, to call out, but his teeth were chattering too violently. The wind howled, and the waves crashed over the raft, drenching them again and again. There was nothing he could do for the dead, and barely anything he could do for the dying beside him. The first few hours were a blur of cold, terror, and the dawning realization that their fight had just begun. The company of the dying was a silent, chilling presence in the small, battered raft. Frank Mays, the third mate, was still there, a grim shadow beside Dennis. But the other two, George Hamill and John O'Brien, were fading fast. Their movements became sluggish, their breathing shallow. Dennis watched as O'Brien's head slumped forward, his eyes staring blankly at the churning water inside the raft. There was no struggle, no sound, just a quiet surrender to the cold that had already claimed so many. A few minutes later, Hamill followed. His body went limp, his hand slipping from the rope he had been clinging to. Dennis looked at Frank, who just shook his head slowly, his face etched with a despair that went beyond words. 2 more gone. Just like that. The cold was a relentless enemy, picking them off one by one. Dennis felt a desperate urge to do something, anything, but his own body was protesting, screaming from the cold. He could barely move his fingers, let alone offer comfort or help to men who were already beyond it. The raft was getting heavier, lower in the water, burdened by the dead weight of their shipmates. It was a terrible thought, but he knew what had to be done. For his own survival, and for Frank's, those bodies couldn't stay in the raft. With Frank's help, they managed to push the bodies of Hamill and O'Brien out into the dark, unforgiving lake. It was a horrific act, one that would haunt Dennis for years to come, but in that moment it was a necessity, a cold, brutal calculation for survival. The raft lifted a little, gaining a precious inch or two above the waves. Now, it was just Dennis and Frank. 2 men left out of a crew of 29. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the roar of the wind and the crashing waves. Dennis tried to focus on small tasks, anything to keep his mind from the horror. He bailed water with his hands, scooping out the icy lake that constantly sloshed into the raft. He rubbed his arms, trying to generate some warmth, though it felt like a futile effort. He looked at Frank, trying to catch his eye, to share some unspoken hope. But Frank's gaze was fixed on the horizon, a distant, empty stare. The fight against giving up was a constant internal battle. Every fiber of his being screamed for warmth, for rest, for an end to the agony. But something deep inside, a stubborn will to live, kept him going. He thought of his family, of his home, of everything he would lose if he just closed his eyes and let go. The sun rose, painting the sky with a pale, weak light, but it brought no warmth. The day dragged on, an eternity of cold, wet misery. Frank started to talk less, his voice growing weaker, his words slurring. Dennis tried to keep him engaged, asking questions, talking about anything he could think of. But Frank's responses became shorter, more distant. Dennis watched helplessly as Frank's condition worsened. He could see the signs he had just witnessed in Hamill and O'Brien, the glazed eyes, the slow, shallow breathing. Then Frank started to hallucinate. He talked about seeing land, about a hot meal, about his wife waiting for him. Dennis tried to bring him back, to tell him it wasn't real, but Frank was already too far gone. He watched as the life slowly drained from Frank's eyes, As his head finally dropped, his body going slack against the side of the raft, Dennis was alone. Completely and utterly alone. 3 men had died beside him in the raft, and countless others in the lake. He was the last one. The isolation was crushing, a weight heavier than any wave. He knew he had to push Frank's body out too, but the thought of doing it alone, of being the only living soul left in that vast, cold emptiness, was almost too much to bear. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering every last shred of his resolve, and with a heavy heart, he completed the grim task. The raft was empty now, save for him. The grim reality hit him with full force. He was truly on his own. The hours stretched into an endless torment, the cold a constant, gnawing presence. He was numb, both physically and emotionally, yet the will to survive, however faint, flickered on. The hours stretched into an endless torment, the cold a constant gnawing presence. He was numb, both physically and emotionally, yet the will to survive, however faint, flickered on. The sun eventually set again, plunging him into another night. This one felt even longer, deeper, and colder than the last. He had no way of telling time beyond the darkness and the faint glow that sometimes appeared on the horizon. His body ached in places he didn't know existed. Every movement was a monumental effort, each breath a shallow, painful gasp. The constant spray from the waves soaked him through, and the wind bit into his skin like tiny, sharp teeth. He shivered uncontrollably, a deep rattling tremor that shook his entire frame. Hunger and thirst began to claw at him. His throat was raw, his lips cracked and bleeding. He tried to lick the moisture from the air, but it offered no relief. His mind, already battered by the horror of the past day, started to play tricks on him. He saw shapes in the churning water, faces of his lost crewmates, arms reaching out to him from the depths. He heard voices, faint whispers carried on the wind calling his name. Sometimes they sounded like his mother, gentle and reassuring. Other times they were menacing, taunting him, telling him to give up. He knew deep down that these weren't real, but the line between what was real and what was born from his desperate imagination blurred with each passing minute. He remembered seeing a warm, inviting beach, complete with palm trees and soft sand. He could almost feel the sun on his skin, the gentle lapping of waves against his feet. He reached out, trying to touch the sand, only to find his hand plunging into the icy lake. The shock of the cold brought him back to the harsh reality of his situation, if only for a moment. Then the visions would return, vivid and compelling. He saw rescue ships, huge vessels with bright lights, approaching him, their horns blaring. He would shout, wave his arms, expending precious energy, only for the ships to vanish, leaving him in the same desolate expanse of water. The disappointment was a fresh wound each time, cutting deeper than the cold. There were moments, many of them, when he wanted to give up. The thought of just letting go, of succumbing to the cold and finding peace, was incredibly tempting. His body screamed for rest, for an end to the suffering. He closed his eyes, imagining the warmth of his bed, the comfort of his home. He pictured his family, their faces clear in his mind. He could almost hear their voices, feel their touch. It would be so easy to just drift off, to let the cold take him. But then, a stubborn spark would ignite within him. A memory, perhaps, of a promise he'd made, or simply the ingrained human instinct to survive. He thought of his mother waiting for him. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't let his story end here, alone in the middle of a freezing lake. He forced his eyes open, forcing himself to move, to bail more water, to rub his arms, anything to keep the blood flowing, to keep the life in his body. He talked to himself, his voice hoarse and barely a whisper, repeating his name, reminding himself he was still alive. "Dennis Hale," he mumbled. "You're still here. You're still breathing." The physical exhaustion was immense, pushing his body to its absolute limits. His muscles cramped, his joints screamed, and his head throbbed with a dull, constant ache. Every fiber of his being was screaming for relief, but he pushed past it. He focused on the small victories. Another minute alive, another wave successfully ridden, another hallucination fought off. He knew that if he stopped fighting, even for a second, it would be over. The lake would claim him just as it had claimed everyone else. He refused to let that happen. He had to keep going. He had no choice. He had to keep going. He had no choice. The sun, a weak, watery presence, finally started its descent again. Another day was ending, and he was still adrift. The passing ships were the cruelest trick of all. He would see a distant smudge on the horizon, a faint light, and his heart would leap. He would gather every last ounce of strength, waving his arms, shouting into the vast emptiness. His voice, a raw, painful rasp, was swallowed by the wind and waves. The smudge would grow a little larger, then slowly, agonizingly, it would shrink again, disappearing into the grey. Each time the hope that had surged through him would drain away, leaving him colder, more defeated than before. It was a cycle of desperate optimism and crushing disappointment that chipped away at his resolve. He saw cargo ships, their decks lit up, looking like entire cities compared to his tiny raft. He saw fishing boats, smaller, but still so massive next to him. He even thought he saw a passenger vessel once, its windows glowing warmly. None of them saw him. He was a speck, invisible in the vast, unforgiving expanse of Lake Huron. He imagined the people on those ships, warm, dry, eating hot food, completely unaware of the horror unfolding just miles away. The unfairness of it all was almost as painful as the cold. He would collapse back into the raft, sobbing silently, the tears freezing on his cheeks. Meanwhile, back on land, the search effort had begun, though he didn't know it. When the Daniel J. Morrell failed to report in, alarms were raised. This was late November, a dangerous time on the Great Lakes. The Coast Guard and other vessels were dispatched. They knew the storm had been brutal. They knew the ship was old. The sheer size of the lake, however, made finding anything incredibly difficult. The initial assumption, grim as it was that no one could have survived such a wreck in such conditions. The cold, the waves, the sheer violence of the ship breaking apart, it all pointed to a complete loss. They searched, but with little real expectation of finding survivors. Dennis, though, kept going. He didn't know about the search, didn't know about the low expectations. All he knew was the relentless cold and the constant fight. He was convinced he was alone, the last living thing in this frozen hell. He had pushed the last body out hours ago, a silent, desperate act to keep his own meager space. The raft was his entire world, a tiny, unstable island in an ocean of despair. Then, on what felt like the 100th time he scanned the horizon, something was different. It wasn't a smudge, not a distant light. It was a distinct shape, growing steadily larger, and it was heading right for him. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced it was another hallucination. But it remained. A plane, a small twin-engine aircraft flying low over the water. His heart hammered against his ribs. A frantic drumbeat of disbelief and sudden, overwhelming hope. He tried to shout, but his voice was gone, just a dry croak. He waved his arms, frantic, clumsy movements. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He fell back, tears streaming down his face. Not of sorrow, but of pure, unadulterated relief. The plane dipped its wings, circled once and then again. It was definitely coming for him. They had seen him. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer alone. The sound of the engines, faint at first, grew louder, a beautiful, life-affirming roar. It was the most incredible sound he had ever heard. This wasn't a dream. This was real. After 38 hours of fighting, of seeing death all around him, of battling his own mind, someone had finally found him. His final, desperate efforts had worked. The plane circled a third time, lower now, and Dennis could make out the Coast Guard markings. A small inflatable boat was dropped from its belly, hitting the water with a splash not far from his raft. Two men in bright orange suits quickly maneuvered it towards him. He watched them with wide, unblinking eyes, his mind struggling to process what was happening. It felt unreal, like he was watching a movie. One of the men, a burly guy with a kind face, reached out a gloved hand. "We've got you, son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle amidst the roar of the plane above and the waves slapping against the boats. Dennis tried to speak, to thank him, but only a raspy sound came out. His jaw was locked, his whole body stiff with cold. They carefully pulled him from the raft, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. The simple act of being lifted felt like an enormous effort, a strange mix of pain and relief. He was laid gently in the bottom of the inflatable, wrapped in a thermal blanket that felt like a burning fire against his frozen skin. The sensation was intense, almost painful, but he welcomed it. He was alive. He was truly, finally, alive. They sped towards a larger Coast Guard vessel, its grey hull appearing like a mountain on the horizon. On board, a team of medics was waiting. They worked quickly, efficiently, cutting away his ruined clothes, checking his pulse, and trying to warm him up. He was incredibly cold, his body temperature dangerously low. They covered him in more blankets, brought him inside a warm cabin, and started an IV. He couldn't feel much, his nerves dulled by the extreme cold, but he registered the warmth, the soft voices, the absence of the relentless wind and waves. He tried to answer their questions, but his words were slurred, his thoughts scattered. He mumbled about the ship, about the others, but they just nodded, their faces grim. He was in and out of consciousness, drifting between the warmth of the cabin and the terrifying memories of the icy lake. The medics kept talking to him, reassuring him, telling him he was safe. He clung to those words. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only an hour or two, he was transferred to a larger ship, then eventually airlifted to a hospital. The ordeal was far from over. His body was a wreck. Severe hypothermia had taken its toll, and his hands and feet were badly frostbitten. There was a real risk of losing some of his fingers and toes. He was weak, exhausted, and barely able to keep his eyes open. It was in the hospital, wrapped in warm blankets, hooked up to machines, that the full weight of what had happened hit him. A kind-faced doctor, his voice soft, told him the news. "You're a miracle, son," the doctor said, patting his arm gently. "They found your life raft. You were the only one." Dennis just stared at him. The only one. The words echoed in his head, a hollow, terrible sound. 37 men, all gone. He was the only one left. The faces of his shipmates flashed before his eyes, the quiet engineer, the jovial cook, the young deckhand who had shared a joke with him just hours before the storm. They were all dead, and he had survived. A wave of nausea washed over him, not from his injuries, but from the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. Why him? Why not someone else? Why was he spared when all his friends had perished in the freezing water? The triumph of his survival, the sheer relief of being found, was immediately overshadowed by this devastating truth. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the hospital bed doing little to thaw the new, deeper cold that had settled in his heart. He had escaped the lake, but he knew even then that the ghosts of the Daniel J. Morrell would stay with him forever. He had been rescued, but the real aftermath, the emotional one, was just beginning. The physical recovery was long and hard. Dennis spent weeks in the hospital, battling infections and undergoing treatments for his frostbite. Doctors worked tirelessly to save his fingers and toes, and thankfully they mostly succeeded, though he would carry the scars of that terrible exposure for the rest of his life. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the pain in his mind. The nightmares started almost immediately. He would wake up screaming, reliving the moment the ship split, the icy plunge, the faces of his friends as they slipped away into the dark water. Sleep offered no escape. It only brought back the horrors. He struggled with anxiety, a constant tightness in his chest, a fear that another disaster was always just around the corner. Loud noises, the smell of lake water, even just the sight of a large boat could trigger flashbacks that left him breathless and shaking. He felt a deep, gnawing guilt. Why him? This question haunted him day and night. He would replay every moment, wondering if there was something he could have done, some way to save just one more person. He knew intellectually that there wasn't, that the speed and violence of the sinking had left no time for heroics, but his heart refused to accept it. The Morrell disaster defined the rest of Dennis Hale's life. He couldn't go back to sea, not after what he had experienced. The thought of stepping onto another ship filled him with dread. Instead, he found a new purpose, sharing his story. He became a speaker, traveling across the country, talking to groups about maritime safety, the power of resilience, and the importance of remembering those lost in the Great Lakes. He spoke to Coast Guard recruits, to historical societies, to anyone who would listen. He felt a responsibility to be the voice for the 37 men who had no voice. His efforts were a way to honor his shipmates, to ensure their sacrifice wasn't forgotten. He advocated for better safety regulations on the Great Lakes, pushing for stronger ships, more rigorous inspections, and improved emergency procedures. He believed that if his story could prevent even one more tragedy, then his survival had meaning. He also became a central figure in the remembrance of the Daniel J. Morrell. Every year, on the anniversary of the sinking, he would participate in ceremonies, helping to keep the memory of the crew alive. It was a heavy burden, but also a source of strength. Dennis Hale's story became a testament to human endurance, a powerful reminder of the incredible will to survive against impossible odds. He was a living example of what the human spirit could withstand. His experiences resonated with so many people, offering hope and inspiration in the face of adversity. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a teacher, a witness, a reminder of the raw power of nature and the fragility of life. In his later years, Dennis found a measure of peace. The nightmares never completely went away, and the guilt remained a quiet companion, but he learned to live with them. He understood that his survival wasn't a curse, but a chance to make a difference. He often reflected on his experience, not with bitterness but with a profound sense of gratitude for the life he was given. He accepted his role as the sole survivor, carrying the weight of the past, but looking towards the future with a quiet determination. His life was a beacon, a story that reminded everyone that even in the darkest of times, hope could still float. The memory of the Daniel J. Morrell and its crew lived on, carried forward by the man who defied death, a man named Dennis Hale. He passed away in 2015 at the age of 75, leaving behind a legacy of courage, resilience, and an unforgettable tale of survival.